Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we are diving into the world of Canine Distemper Virus.
Woo! Exciting.
Specifically looking at, the neurological impacts it can have. And we're honing in on a really interesting research study published in Microbial Pathogenesis by Kokaturk and their team. And it's really a deep dive into what's happening in the immune response in dogs that are battling the neurological form of CDV.
Yeah, the study is fascinating because they really are trying to look at the whole picture of what's happening when a dog has a CDV infection.
Yeah, they looked at blood samples and cerebrospinal fluid samples.
Exactly.
But let's talk about this study design because, I think it's interesting how they broke things up into groups. They, the group of dogs that had CDV and neurological symptoms, and then they had the healthy controls.
Yeah, and they were looking at so many different things, too. They looked at cytokines and chemokines and inflammatory markers and antioxidants, which really gives us a big picture view of what's happening in the body.
Yeah, and they uncovered some pretty significant differences between the infected dogs and the healthy ones, right?
Yeah, definitely.
In a number of areas.
Yeah, for example, IL-7, which is so important for lymphocyte survival, was significantly elevated in the infected dogs.
Oh, wow.
And IL-8, which is kind of like the signal that draws all the immune cells to the site of the infection, that was also elevated.
Interesting.
And then you have MCP-1, which is another really important player in recruiting immune cells and kind of driving that inflammatory process, and that was also elevated.
So we are talking like immune system on overdrive here.
Totally. The immune system is just working overtime. And they also found that the infected dogs had elevated levels of C-reactive protein and haptoglobin, which are well-established markers of inflammation.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the body is really trying to fight back here. But I mean, it's not just passively taking a beating, right?
Right.
I mean, they also looked at antioxidants.
Yes.
Which are kind of like the body's defense system.
Yeah, exactly. They found elevated levels of FRAP and thiol in the infected dog's serum, which means that the body is trying to fight back against oxidative stress.
Which is just basically damage to the cells, right?
Yeah, oxidative stress is often linked to inflammation and cell damage.
It's almost like a tug of war,
Yeah.
Viruses attacking immune system is fighting back.
Right.
Body's trying to limit the damage, but we're not just looking at the body as a whole here, right?
Exactly.
They also looked at their cerebrospinal fluid to get a little closer look at what's happening in the brain.
And that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
For example, the infected dogs had significantly higher levels of BCE in their cerebrospinal fluid compared to their serum.
And BCE, for those who don't know, is involved in neurotransmission, and it might even have some anti-inflammatory effects.
Exactly. And so this finding suggests that maybe there's this protective mechanism within the brain that's trying to counteract all of this inflammation that's happening.
So it's almost like the brain is mounting its own separate defense.
In a way, yeah.
But let's take a step back for a moment and think about, the overall correlation or lack thereof between what they found in the blood and what they found in the cerebrospinal fluid.
That's really important because apart from IL-6 and MCP-1, which did show a correlation, most of the markers weren't that similar between the serum and the cerebrospinal fluid.
So even though CDV is a systemic disease, it's not just a simple spillover from what's happening in the rest of the body into the brain.
It seems like the brain might be doing its own thing.
Yeah.
It might have its own separate immune response that's not totally connected to what's happening in the blood.
Which begs the question, how much can we actually tell from a blood test?
Exactly.
About what's happening in the brain during a CDV infection?
That's a great question.
It is something to ponder, for sure. And while we're on the topic of things that make you go, let's talk about those antioxidant findings in the cerebrospinal fluid, because that's where it gets really, really interesting.
So remember how we were talking about FRAP and thiol being elevated in the serum of infected dogs?
Why?
Well, when they looked at the cerebrospinal fluid, the levels of those same markers were actually lower.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. You would think that the brain, being so sensitive to oxidative damage, would be working even harder to boost those antioxidants?
You would think that.
Yeah.
Right. But that's what makes this finding so fascinating.
Okay.
It suggests that maybe the brain isn't as good at mounting that antioxidant defense. Or maybe the antioxidants are being used up so quickly that we're not seeing them in the cerebrospinal fluid.
So the brain could actually be losing the battle against oxidative damage?
It's a possibility.
That's a little unsettling.
Yeah, it raises some concerns about the long-term impacts of CDV on the brain.
Which brings us to the question, could this be a major factor in the severity of the neurological symptoms that we see in some cases of CDV?
Yeah, that's a really important question and one that needs more research.
Absolutely.
And it really emphasizes the need to look into therapies that maybe can boost those antioxidant defenses in the brain.
And, this study wasn't without its limitations. They did acknowledge that they didn't have access to actual brain tissue.
Right. They didn't have any brain tissue samples.
From the infected dogs.
Which would have been really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it would have given them a much more direct view of the damage happening at a cellular level.
Right. We could have actually seen what the virus was doing to the brain cells.
It's kind of like we've got the satellite images, but we don't have that ground level view.
Exactly.
And they also didn't follow the infected dogs long term, did they?
No, they didn't, unfortunately.
And that long-term data, that would be so valuable to see how these biomarkers change over time.
Exactly. It would give us a much better understanding of how the disease progresses.
Right, and how effective different treatment strategies might be.
Right, because right now we're just getting a snapshot in time.
Yeah, and there's also the fact that they didn't have cerebrospinal fluid data from the healthy control group.
Yeah, that's true.
Which ethically makes sense.
Yeah.
But it does make it a little harder to draw definitive conclusions about how CDV is specifically impacting that cerebrospinal fluid environment.
Right. It's like we're missing some of the puzzle pieces.
Exactly. But even with these limitations, the study still provides some really valuable insights.
Oh, absolutely.
Into how complex this virus's impact on the brain is.
Yeah, it really highlights how the immune system, inflammation, and oxidative stress all play a role.
Right, and it suggests that the brain might be particularly vulnerable to this disease.
For sure.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what kind of research do we need to really fill in these missing pieces of the puzzle?
Well, I think studies that incorporate brain histopathology would be really valuable.
So we can actually see the damage.
We need to see what's happening at the microscopic level.
And what about those long-term follow-up studies?
Yes, those would be amazing.
Imagine if we could predict which dogs are most at risk.
Oh, that would be a game changer.
For developing those serious neurological complications.
Absolutely.
It would allow vets to have much more informed discussions with owners about prognosis and, what to expect.
For sure.
And obviously, we need to do a deeper dive into these specific mechanisms we've been talking about.
Right.
The roles of IL-6 and MCP-1.
Yeah.
The potential protective effects of BChE.
Right.
The impact of oxidative stress. Like, all of these things need more research.
We need to understand how they all fit together.
Exactly. And there's one more area I think we should touch on.
Okay, what's that?
The gut microbiome.
Oh, interesting.
Now, I know that might seem a little out there.
Yeah.
But there is growing evidence that the gut microbiome can actually impact brain health.
It's true.
And it's possible that in CDV, the gut microbiome could be modulating the immune response and the inflammation, which indirectly then affects the brain.
So there could be a gut-brain connection in CDV.
That's pretty wild.
It is. It's a really exciting area of research.
Yeah, it could open up a whole new avenue for treatment.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this research so exciting.
Yeah.
It's not just about finding answers.
Right.
It's about uncovering new questions and new areas to explore.
Absolutely. And pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
Yes. And that's what ultimately leads to better outcomes for our patients.
Well said. So to wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question. Could the key to protecting the brain from CDV lie in manipulating the immune response itself?
That's the crux of the matter, and it's something that a lot of researchers are already looking into. We're seeing some really promising research on using antioxidants, like vitamin E and selenium, to protect the brain from oxidative damage.
So could those same antioxidants be helpful in CDV cases?
It's definitely worth investigating.
Yeah.
And when it comes to inflammation, the focus is really shifting towards more targeted therapies that can dampen that harmful immune response without completely shutting down the whole system.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is.
You need the immune system to fight the virus, but you don't want it to go overboard and cause more damage in the brain.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, and that's where those key players we talked about, like IL-6 and MCP-1, come in. If we could block or modulate those signals, we might be able to prevent that inflammatory cascade from reaching the brain.
So it's like intercepting those inflammatory messages before they can do any harm.
Exactly. And in human medicine, they're doing some really interesting work with monoclonal antibodies that target these these inflammatory mediators.
So applying those findings to veterinary medicine.
Right.
And developing similar treatments for CDV that's not completely out of reach?
Not at all.
Wow. And then there's the gut microbiome,
right,
which could be a real game changer.
If research confirms that it really does influence the immune response in CDV,
then we could potentially develop therapies that target the gut to protect the brain.
It's pretty amazing to think about.
It is.
Something happening in the gut could have such a big impact on the brain.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does, and it opens up so many possibilities for treatment.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has.
We've explored the immune response inflammation, oxidative stress, and CDV, and we've learned a lot about how this virus affects the brain.
And we've highlighted how much more research is needed.
Absolutely.
To better understand and treat this disease.
So to all of our listeners out there, stay curious.
Yes.
Stay informed and keep advocating for your furry friends.
Because knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
And the more we know about CDV, the better we can protect our dogs.
Well said.
From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds-inspired hearts light and tails wagging.